they were dealing with bladder cancer. He is having his bladder removed, and they will create a new bladder with one of his intestines because it fully removes the cancer.
When Florida wildlife officials first floated the idea of releasing thousands of specialized creatures into the swamps to hunt down one of the most dangerous invasive predators on the continent, almost nobody took it seriously. Late-night hosts joked about it. Social media turned it into a meme within hours. Even some biologists rolled their eyes, convinced the whole plan was little more than a desperate publicity stunt dressed up as science. But a few years later, the numbers tell a very different story. And the people who mocked the plan the loudest are the ones now struggling to explain how something so ridiculed actually started winning a war that seemed unwinnable. To understand why this story became such a lightning rod, you have to go back to where the crisis actually began, decades before anyone in Tallahassee ever floated the idea of fighting snakes with more snakes. The Everglades is one of the strangest, most fragile ecosystems on the planet. It is not really a swamp in the traditional sense, but a slow-moving river of grass stretching across thousands of square miles of South Florida, feeding an intricate web of wetlands, mangroves, and hardwood hammocks that support species found nowhere else on Earth. For thousands of years, that ecosystem had a kind of balance. Predators and prey kept each other in check. Then, starting in the 1970s, something began arriving that nature never accounted for. Burmese pythons, native to the jungles and grasslands of Southeast Asia, started showing up in the exotic pet trade. They were marketed as impressive, low-maintenance additions to a serious reptile collection. What most buyers did not fully grasp was that a hatchling python small enough to coil in the palm of a hand could grow into a 16-foot, 100-pound animal within just a few years. Plenty of owners were not prepared for that reality, and plenty of pythons ended up released into canals, dumped along roadsides, or simply escaped during storms. A major hurricane in the early 1990s tore through a breeding facility south of Miami and freed an unknown number of snakes directly into the wetlands, giving the population an unplanned head start. From there, the math turned brutal. A single female python can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in a single clutch. With no natural predators built to handle an apex constrictor of that size, and with prey animals in the Everglades having no evolutionary instinct to recognize pythons as a threat, the snakes had almost nothing standing between them and total dominance. Within a few decades, researchers estimate that tens of thousands of pythons had spread across the mainland, and in some of the hardest-hit areas of Everglades National Park, populations of native mammals like marsh rabbits, raccoons, and opossums had collapsed by more than 90%. Deer, wading birds, and even young alligators started turning up in python stomachs. The snake that was supposed to stay in a terrarium had become the single most destructive invasive predator the region had ever seen. State agencies threw resources at the problem for years. They organized public hunts with cash prizes, hired contracted hunters who patrolled levees at night with flashlights and hooks, and asked ordinary residents to report sightings. It worked, to a point. Hunters removed thousands of pounds of snake from the wild, and each removal genuinely mattered. But the fundamental issue never went away. Pythons are almost impossible to find. Their skin pattern blends perfectly with dappled light and leaf litter. They can remain motionless for hours, and studies eventually confirmed a number that stunned even seasoned wildlife biologists. The odds of a trained person spotting a python that is actually present in an area are less than 1%. You could walk directly past a 15-foot snake in thick brush and never know it was there. That statistic is the real reason the story that follows matters. Florida was not just fighting an animal. It was fighting an animal that was, for all practical purposes, invisible. By the time wildlife managers started talking publicly about deploying specialized creatures across the python's range in far greater numbers than any previous hunting program, the public conversation had already turned skeptical, then outright mocking. Headlines framed it as a state throwing money at a problem it could not solve through normal means. Comment sections filled with jokes about Florida solving one invasive species problem by introducing another. Cable news segments treated it as a punchline, cutting between clips of massive pythons and officials trying to explain, with a straight face, that the plan involved releasing thousands of creatures whose entire purpose was to seek out and destroy the snakes hiding in the wetlands. Part of the backlash came from genuine, reasonable caution. Florida has a long and painful history with well-intentioned wildlife interventions that backfired spectacularly. Cane toads, introduced elsewhere to control agricultural pests, became their own ecological disaster. Non-native fish stock for sport fishing wiped out native species in several Florida lakes. Given that track record, it made sense that people would be suspicious of any plan that sounded like it was solving one invasive species crisis by deliberately introducing something new into a landscape that was already overwhelmed. But what critics largely missed, and what almost never made it into the viral clips and headlines, was that the creatures being deployed were not some exotic import shipped in from overseas. They were drawn from Florida's own backyard, or in some cases, they were not creatures in the traditional sense at all, but a combination of biological tools, trained animals, and technology working together under one umbrella that the public simply lumped into a single mocking narrative. The reality of the program was far more layered, far more scientific, and, as it turned out, far more effective than the jokes ever gave it credit for. The first and most surprising piece of the puzzle involved a native species that had been living alongside pythons the entire time without much public attention: the Florida king snake. King snakes are famous among reptile enthusiasts for one specific trait. They are largely immune to the venom of the snakes they prey on, and more importantly for this story, they are known for constricting and consuming other snakes, including individuals nearly as large as themselves. Researchers had documented isolated cases of wild Florida king snakes killing and eating juvenile Burmese pythons, a discovery that initially seemed like nothing more than an interesting footnote in a scientific journal. But it planted an idea. If a native predator was already capable of taking down young pythons before they grew large enough to become a serious threat, then deliberately supporting and expanding that natural relationship, rather than introducing something foreign, might offer a way to attack the problem at its most vulnerable stage before hatchlings ever had the chance to mature into 6-foot hunters themselves. Programs began quietly expanding suitable habitat for native king snake populations in python-heavy zones, alongside monitored, carefully controlled releases designed to boost their numbers in the exact corridors where python nests were most commonly found. It was not glamorous. It did not produce dramatic footage of a massive snake being dragged out of a canal. But over time, wildlife trackers began noticing a measurable dip in the survival rate of python hatchlings in the areas where king snake populations had been reinforced, exactly the kind of quiet, compounding result that never trends online but genuinely changes an ecosystem's trajectory. The second, and arguably more radical, piece of the plan had nothing to do with introducing a new predator at all. It involved turning the pythons into hunters of their own kind. Researchers began surgically implanting radio transmitters into adult male pythons, then releasing those same snakes back into the wild during breeding season. Because male pythons are biologically driven to search out large, reproductively active females across enormous home ranges, tracking their movement effectively turned every tagged male into a living guide, leading biologists straight to the biggest, most reproductively significant snakes in the population. Wildlife teams nicknamed these radio-tagged male scout snakes, and in some circles, the far more memorable name stuck: Judas snakes, a nod to the fact that each one was, in effect, betraying its own species by leading hunters directly to breeding females capable of laying 100 eggs at a time. The results from this approach alone reshaped how seriously the entire program was taken. In one recent 6-month stretch, a single team using scout snakes to track breeding females removed more than 8,000 pounds of python from a relatively contained area of southwest Florida, a haul that would have taken years to accumulate through traditional night hunts. Because each targeted female represented dozens or even 100 eggs that would never hatch, biologists estimated the program prevented tens of thousands of future pythons from ever entering the ecosystem. It was not thousands of new creatures released to fight snakes in the way the headlines implied. It was thousands of decisions, informed by biology most people had never heard of, that used the python's own instincts as the weapon against it. Then there was a piece of the plan that genuinely did look like something out of a low-budget spy film, and unsurprisingly, it became the most mocked element of all: robotic decoys built to look, move, and even smell like a marsh rabbit, one of the python's favorite meals. Engineers and wildlife biologists worked together to build battery-powered, fur-covered devices designed to twitch and shuffle in a pattern convincing enough to lure a hidden python out of dense cover, using motion sensors to alert researchers the moment a snake approached. When photos and video of the robotic rabbits first circulated, they were treated as an internet punchline, a strange, almost embarrassing symbol of a state throwing increasingly absurd ideas at a problem it could not otherwise solve. Late-night comedians had a field day imagining a python falling for a machine. But the underlying logic was sound. The core obstacle in the entire python crisis was never really removal, it was detection. If researchers could not find the snakes, they could not remove them, and any tool, however strange it looked on camera, that helped solve the detection problem was worth trying. Early trial data suggested that decoys succeeded in drawing pythons into detectable range in situations where human trackers walking the same stretch of habitat had found nothing at all. Rounding out the strategy were specially trained detection dogs, taught to recognize the specific scent trail of Burmese pythons rather than any of the native snake species living in the same habitat. Dogs process scent information in a completely different way than humans process visual information, and where a human tracker might walk within a few feet of a motionless, camouflaged snake and see nothing, a trained dog could pick up a scent trail from a much greater distance. Handlers reported detection rates that dramatically outperformed human-only searches in test environments, giving wildlife teams another tool to compress the search radius before ever setting a boot on the ground. For a few weeks after the plan became public, it felt like every corner of the internet had something to say about it. Meme pages built entire posts around the idea of Florida solving a snake problem by unleashing an army of even stranger creatures, as if the state had learned nothing from decades of cautionary tales about ecosystems gone wrong. Podcast hosts joked that Florida was the only place on Earth that could turn a wildlife crisis into something that sounded like the plot of a low-budget monster movie. One widely shared post joked that the whole plan sounded like something dreamed up at 2 a.m. by someone who had just finished watching a documentary about parasitic wasps, and that particular joke alone was shared and reposted for weeks. Local news segments tried to strike a more balanced tone, but even they leaned into the strangeness of it all, running footage of the robotic decoys twitching in tall grass set to music clearly chosen to make the whole thing look absurd. Environmental commentators who normally focus on serious policy analysis found themselves fielding questions about whether Florida had simply run out of conventional ideas. A few op-eds went further, arguing that the state was papering over its failure to control the python population through traditional enforcement and habitat management by rolling out a flashy, headline-grabbing gimmick instead. Wildlife officials, for their part, mostly stayed quiet during the peak of the mockery, choosing to let the early data accumulate rather than trying to win an argument in real time on social media, a decision that in hindsight looks a lot more like patience than the indifference some critics accused them of at the time. Skeptical biologists outside the program raised more grounded concerns, some of which were entirely fair. A few worried that radio-tagged pythons released back into the wild, even for research purposes, could still cause damage in the meantime, since a scout snake had to survive, hunt, and roam freely in order to do its job of locating females. Others pointed out that robotic decoys and detection dogs, however clever, were still relatively small-scale tools being tested across a python range that spans thousands of square miles, and that no single innovation was going to reverse decades of unchecked population growth on its own. These were not internet punchlines. They were legitimate scientific concerns raised by people who understood the ecosystem. And to their credit, the teams running the programs treated them as useful feedback rather than attacks to be dismissed. Several protocols around scout snake tracking and release radius were adjusted directly in response to concerns raised by outside researchers during the program's early phase. Looking at all four pieces together, the king snake habitat support, the radio-tagged scout snakes, the robotic decoys, and the detection dogs, it becomes clear why the public reaction missed the mark so badly. Viral headlines and short video clips are built for a single dramatic image, not a layered, multi-year biological strategy. It is far easier to mock a robotic rabbit or joke about the state unleashing thousands of creatures into the swamp than it is to explain the actual science behind using a python's own mating instincts to hunt down the most reproductively important individuals in the population. The genuinely strange visuals, a fake rabbit twitching in the grass, a snake wearing an internal transmitter, a dog trained to sniff out one specific reptile among dozens of lookalikes, made for perfect meme material and terrible science journalism. There was also a deeper skepticism at play, one rooted in real history. Florida residents and biologists alike have watched well-meaning interventions go sideways before, and it is fair and rational to ask hard questions before supporting any large-scale release program, even one built around native species and controlled biological tools rather than new exotic imports. Skepticism toward wildlife management schemes is not automatically foolish. In this case, though, the program had been built specifically to avoid the classic mistakes of the past. Nothing genuinely foreign was introduced into the ecosystem. The king snakes were already native. The scout snakes were already invasive pythons being used against their own kind rather than new animals being added to the landscape. The dickos were mechanical, not biological, meaning they carried none of the ecological risk that comes with releasing a living organism. And the dogs were trained tools working alongside existing human teams rather than a new species entering the food web at all. Once wildlife agencies started publishing results rather than proposals, the tone of the conversation slowly, unevenly, began to shift. Removal totals climbed into the tens of thousands of pounds. Egg prevention estimates reached numbers in the tens of thousands of pythons that would have otherwise hatched. Detection rates using dogs and decoys started outperforming traditional searches by wide margins in controlled test zones. None of these numbers erased the scale of the underlying problem, and no wildlife official ever claimed the python crisis in the Everglades was solved. But the specific programs that had been treated as an internet joke were, according to the actual data being collected, working better than almost anyone outside the research teams had expected. The turning point did not arrive as a single dramatic announcement. It built slowly, through quarterly reports, conference presentations, and the occasional local news follow-up that got a fraction of the attention the original mockery had received. Removal totals began climbing in a way that outpaced almost every previous phase of the broader python control effort. Teams using the scout snake method in particular started posting numbers that made even long-time observers of the program pause. Where earlier removal efforts, relying mostly on public hunts and contracted night patrols, had taken years to accumulate a few tons of snake from a given search area, the scout snake approach compressed that same kind of progress into a matter of months, largely because it stopped relying on chance encounters and started relying on the python's own predictable behavior during breeding season. The egg prevention numbers told an even more striking story, at least to anyone willing to sit with the math for a moment. Removing a single large breeding female during nesting season does not just eliminate one snake, it eliminates every offspring that female would have produced that year, and potentially every offspring her daughters would have gone on to produce in the years after that. Biologists tracking the program's results estimated that the eggs prevented through scout snake tracking alone numbered in the tens of thousands, a figure that, if left unchecked,